Good afternoon, everyone. Eric Prince here, Editor-in-Chief of Marion West. I'm joined today by Faisal Saeed Al Mutar, who is the founder of the organization Ideas Beyond Borders and is, I'm going to say, an expert of sorts about the war in Iraq. So we're going to talk.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to talk today about his organization, sort of a retrospective on the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, and then at the end sort of zoom out and make a few general comments about the current state of the Middle East. So Faisal, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you're the founder of Ideas Beyond Borders. So for those of us who aren't as familiar with the organization and its mission and its history, maybe you can provide a summary.
Of course. So Ideas Beyond Borders' mission is about making inaccessible information accessible to people in the Middle East. What does that look like in practice? Is that we translate books, articles, videos that are on subjects that are mostly censored and not readily available, and because of authoritarian regimes and censorship all across the region. So from books about democracy, human rights, enlightenment, and we cover 4 languages: Arabic, Farsi, Kurdish, and Pashto. We have 2 major programs. One is called the House of Wisdom 2.0, which is named after the first House of Wisdom in Baghdad in the 13th century, where they used to translate the works of the Greeks and Romans and others into the languages of the region. So this is the recreation of this initiative that used to be the golden age of the Middle East. And then we have another program called the Innovation Hub, which is to activate people who believe in these ideals in these regions. So if somebody wants to do a critical thinking workshop about democracy, or somebody wants to hire women in Afghanistan and he has a business model to make that happen. So we also have a funding arm, which is the Innovation Hub. So mainly, I mean, the idea started as a result of really growing up there and seeing how much knowledge. I mean, there was this report from the United Nations about 2 decades ago that it says there are more books translated to Spanish in 1 year than Arabic in 1,000 years. So there is very little. If you go to New York Public Library and you go to any major library in the world, you can guess that most of that knowledge is not available to the 350 million people who live in the region. And there are many efforts to kind of change that, and we are part of that kind of consortium of multiple organizations that try to change the ecosystem of information in the region.
And at what year did the organization begin?
2017 is when we are registered in America, but we also, as of 2 years ago, we are registered in the Kurdistan region of Iraq and in Dubai.
So I think most people watching this are familiar with the general plot of censorship in that part of the world, whether in Iran or in other places, but maybe you can just speak for a moment on the current state of censorship, sort of country by country. Where are some of the bright spots and where are some of the worst spots?
So, I mean, it does change a lot. And in terms of the worst, as you mentioned, Iran right now is one of the worst in terms of censorship. And it kind of goes double, because Iran is a sanctioned country by the United States. So by default, multiple companies cannot operate there. There was a lift of the sanctions recently because of the protest in which the State Department allowed companies like Facebook and Twitter, etc., to be able to work there. But in terms of the most extreme censorship, it's in Iran and Syria and Yemen to some extent. In terms of Iraq, we are in terms of because there's 2 kind of type of censorship. There's one that is about the information, which is internet, which is technically controlling the internet service provider, and then there is one that's kind of what I refer to as physical censorship. So physical censorship is that you're a journalist, writer, you write something critical of the government, and then you disappear next day, and then sometimes even members of your family disappear. So that's still very common in Iraq, especially in the southern and central part of the country. But as the internet itself, the internet is mostly free. It's just that freedom of expression is very limited. Then there are countries kind of like Egypt, which has a free internet in terms of information, but they also restrict civil society groups and others from working with any kind of foreign entity. So they have their treason or treacherous laws are they be very expansive to deal with any organization that works with any international NGO, etc. So it really varies between one country to another, but at the moment, the scariest part is Iran, because they're also buying some of the Chinese surveillance technology. So as of a couple of weeks ago, the BBC reported that Iran right now has an artificial intelligence and cameras all across Tehran to figure out if women are wearing a headscarf or not. That's a technology that they recently bought from China. So the country is evolving in terms of censorship compared to other places around the region.
So you alluded to this a little bit with China. Obviously, the Middle East is a region where various major global players have tried to carve out spheres of influence and tried to sort of influence events. Would you be able to give a sort of an overview of how the various sort of major players, whether Russia, China, the United States, are sort of currently involved with affairs in the various countries that you work in or operate in?
So the status quo last year, like 10 years ago, was that the United States was allied with the Gulf and petrostates. That's Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, other Emirates, etc. So they were kind of, these were the allies, and then there's Jordan and Egypt to some extent. Then that kind of is changing. The China right now, Saudi Arabia has signaled a lot of interest of building relationship with China. So United States is losing some of its allies in the region, and China is emerging as the kind of the biggest player in terms of both investment, in terms of military equipments, and as I mentioned, the surveillance technology and etc. So that would include Huawei and the technology that comes with it. In terms of Russia, Russia is very active in Syria. So Russia has a military base inside Syria. In fact, it's the reason why the regime of Syria is still in power, is because of the intervention from Russia to save the Assad regime from multiple opposition forces and militias. In Iraq, it's to some extent you have the kind of the federal government of Iraq, and then there's the autonomous region of Kurdistan, which is the autonomous region of Kurdistan is more allied with the United States, while the federal government is not. It's more allied with Russia and China. So really the axis right now is that Gulf states are somewhere in between. They work with both. Some exclusively work with Russia, and that would mean Syria. And China right now is kind of acting as a new major player in terms of breaking peace deals. There was a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran last month that was broke by China. There was a deal between Saudi Arabia and Syria that was done by Russia. So right now, in terms of strength, I mean, the U.S. still has military bases and stuff in some of the Gulf states, but that might change within the next decade or so.
Do you think it's because China's economy is ascendant relative to the United States, because there are domestic political voices in the United States that have sort of advocated for less interest in the Middle East, arguably as a result of what we'll talk about in a little bit, which was the war in Iraq, a combination of the two other factors? What do you see as sort of the reason for China's relative ascendancy?
I would say there are many reasons. I mean, first reason is that the United States more and more is growing as a non-reliable ally. So many players in the region see the United States as a kind of a temporary player that has kind of some interest, and then when they lose interest, they just leave. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was a great blow to that kind of reinforcement of that view. Is that the United States can support a government for a couple of decades and then announce withdrawal, and then they leave the supposed allies right to be captured by the Taliban and etc. So the thing that China offers, and kind of to some extent, I would say maybe the advantage of authoritarian regimes in foreign policy, is that what you see is what you get. If China makes a deal with you right now, it's going to be the same deal 10 years from now, it's going to be the same deal 20 years from now. While what the US has is that, because it's one hand a democracy, but on the other hand, it has interest, what you might sign right now as a deal with the United States might not be the deal 5 or 6 years from now. And that I would say, a major piece of the puzzle.
Because there's a new president who might want to do things in a radically different fashion.
Yeah, that's I would say is, and also the fact, I mean, that sometimes I became interested in American domestic affairs, is that the fact that the polarization of the United States in terms of very different policies. For example, Iran, and when the Democrats are more in favor of making a deal with Iran, well, when Trump became the president, this was one of the main things is that he cancels the Iran deal. So this kind of polarization of shifting between different policies, on the long term, that leads many of the, especially kind of regimes in the Middle East, to look at this and will be like, I would rather make a deal with China than the United States. And China is offering to some extent a very good deal. That I would say is that, unlike America, which is viewed as sometimes a changer, like there is a lot of America advocates for, I mean, at least in theory, but in practice, not necessarily the case, but advocates for democracy and human rights and all of that stuff. And these things, to some extent, viewed by some of these regimes are things that they don't want. While in China maintains the status quo. They tell them it's like, okay, you can keep what you have. We're not trying to push for anything for you to change your rule. And as a result, that makes them a bit more favorable ally than the United
That's
States.
a really important point. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I mean, if you spend a lot of time watching CGTN is kind of like the Russia Today of China. And they spend a lot of, I mean, billions of dollars, but also great programming that focuses a lot on this specific point, which is that we're a more reliable ally, we're a closer culture, we don't have a history between us and the Middle East of the Crusades and conflict and war and all that stuff, because what they try to do is that they see that the United States is to some extent an extension of the European Christian empire, which used to be in constant conflict with many Muslim countries for centuries. So they see that we are none of that. We don't really have an religious interest in your land. We don't have any kind of history of conflict between us, and so would you rather choose us, who are kind of like a blank slate of some sort, and we don't have really negative history with you guys, or you want to choose the kind of the Crusaders and the extension of the Western forces that by default has a more kind of negative opinion across that.
However, I suppose some would argue that at this moment in time, China, given sort of reports emerging from within China about the treatment of Muslim minorities there, is that not of major concern to certain players in the Middle East?
So yes and no. It's so because of the significant power of disinformation by China, many people in the region believe that this is all like a CIA made up conspiracy theory.
Good point.
So we have done a lot of work within Ideas Beyond Borders that focuses on the treatment of the Uyghurs and the kind of treatment of religious minorities. China's response to that, the official response to that, is that what's happening to the Uyghurs is actually nothing to do with them being Muslims. So what they do is that they show the Han Chinese, and they say, look, the people who are Han Chinese, who live in Beijing, and live in Shanghai, and all of these areas, they are treated well. There's no discrimination against them. The reason why we are against the Uyghurs is because they are a separatist movement that want to get out of China, and some of them have joined terrorist groups and ISIS and other militias. So that is kind of the official narrative that China broadcasts to the Arab world, in which they say that discrimination is not to do with Islam itself. It's more to do with the fact that they are a separatist group that want to kind of destroy the social harmony of China. Well, they show in official televisions Muslims who are from the Han ethnic group who are dancing and integrating into the society and all of that stuff. So this is kind of the official message. And as a result, and it's for many kind of the Arab population, that is a kind of an ethnic group, which is the Uyghurs. It's a group they're not really familiar with. So it's not like it's easier for kind of Arabs to know that, oh, there are African Muslims or something like that. But if you tell them there are Asian Muslims, that to some extent it gets confusing, even though everybody believes that Islam has spread all across the world and there are different ethnic groups. It still hasn't resonated much that there is such a thing as a Chinese Muslims. And as a result, they don't see them as a top priority. And Uyghurs as a group, but also as a region, I mean, the kind of the attention span of the Arab world and the Muslim world is mostly focused on kind of religious sites. So, for example, Jerusalem, that is where significant interest of kind of the Arab population. They're more worried that Jerusalem is being controlled by non-Muslims. But the fact that a country that is 8-hour flight is controlled by the CCP is not really something that that really brings a lot of attention. Even though my organization and others are working so hard to kind of bring that inaccessible information accessible to the Arab world, but I would say is that it's pretty hard because that there are a lot of reasons why people just don't put it as a top priority.
Well, it's interesting to hear sort of to step outside of that American perspective, and you see that all countries and all factions utilize spin, and that's a really interesting example of how China is sort of preempting questions on that subject. I want to circle back to two things you mentioned. First off, you mentioned the Iran nuclear deal. Do you and or your organization take a position on that?
Organization, no. I mean, we kind of as we try to avoid the geopolitics of the region as an organization that works in the region. On a personal level, I think that the Iran nuclear deal has strengthened the Iranian regime. So I think that did it help in deterring the Iranian government, aka the Islamic Republic, from obtaining nuclear weapons? I highly doubt that. I think that they were kind of fooling around with the Americans. It was one way. They knew that the Americans were exhausted by Iraq and Afghanistan, so they know they had the upper hand in that deal to begin with. And that's things that they even broadcasted to the general public within Iran, which because there were a lot of kind of even the Ayatollah stuff that was kind of signaling that we should not make a deal with the Americans and with the West, and the people who are pro the deal within the Iranian government were like, not really. We are getting much more on that than they are getting. So that's what I think is like it benefited more the regime than it helped the United States. What the United States should do about Iran, that's a completely different subject. But I think is that the deal, if we take it as on face value, I think it was pretty good deal for the Iranian regime and not a very good deal for the others. And especially like that's back to the kind of the lesser liability piece from Gulf states and etc. Is that part of the agreement that the United States have with many of these countries is the United States will act as a protector if Iran or neighboring countries would attack them. And when they saw that the United States signed the deal with Iran, they took that the United States did not take their security seriously. And they were one of the first people that were Saudi Arabia or Arab Emirates and etc. They were the first groups who were pushing against the Iran deal. And then they were not taken seriously. And then as a result of that, the trust that they had in the United States started more and more declining. So that's, I can tell you, like in terms of geopolitics, like that was something that made many of Arab allies lose trust in the United States, at least the initial piece of it, and the fact that it strengthened the regime in Iran.
Well, it seems like that's a theme that we're getting on, is this sort of lack of trust in the United States maintaining commitments over time. So to that point, that intersects well with the other issue that I want to circle back to, which is the withdrawal from Afghanistan in late summer 2021. And as you probably recall, domestically within the United States, President Biden's approval rating never really came back over 50% as a result of that. So domestically, and just sort of anecdotally hearing from a lot of people who served in that conflict, felt very on a spectrum from frustrated to outright betrayed about how that unfolded and how that was handled. So can you talk about, and you alluded to this already a little bit, can you talk about how it was seen in various parts of the Middle East?
I mean, I don't know exactly if approval rating was affected by Afghanistan. The thing is that I remember that these kind of the Afghanistan story only lasted a couple of weeks until the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, and then the attention span pretty much shifted towards
Well, if you
that.
look at like the real clear approval rating of President Biden over time, that is where the approval and disapproval crossed, and he never went back up. And that was the moment in time in August 2021.
It was something that, yeah, it was in a way bipartisan in terms of most people disapproving of what happened. I mean, to call it disaster is an understatement. I mean, the United States had all the time in the world to do this more properly than seeing all of these pictures of people jumping from planes, and these pictures like speak more than a million words, as they say. So the thing is that the way that I mean, there were multiple people involved, right? You had kind of the soldiers who were withdrawing, but then there were all of those people, the Afghan, or called the Afghan allies, that put their lives on the line, working with the United States Army and government to fight all of the extremist groups inside Afghanistan, including the Taliban. So many of these people and the translators and all that stuff, many of these people were unprocessed. And some of them are still inside the country.
As you probably recall, certain publications such as the Wall Street Journal were making the point about the translators prior to the withdrawal and saying this is something that needs to be considered on the front end. And it seems as though, in large part, perhaps that advice was not heeded by the administration and those responsible for sort of providing the architecture for the withdrawal.
And these, I mean, the translators are the greatest case. I mean, these are people who, to a large extent, were the people who assisted the United States and worked with them and put their lives on the line. Some of them were even killed in their mission to work with the United States. To see that the U.S. just at least a significant piece of them were just thrown under the bus. That is the signal that the United States is sending, or at least has sent in that withdrawal, in which you had that not necessarily, I would say, the United States intention, or at least that's what might have been intended by the U.S. government, but that is what people are hearing, and they see that the U.S. just the contract ended, and we're just going to throw you under the bus to be killed by the Taliban. And what was worse is that when the United States left, many of the documents and the files and the names of many people who work with the military was leaked. So then, not only that they're left in Afghanistan, but also the Taliban is familiar what their names are, which is by default put them a target. I mean, my organization has assisted in helping and hiring some of those translators who used to work for the U.S. Army to become translators for us, and that's the reason why we were able to do the translations in Farsi and Pashto, is actually hiring many of these people who were left behind to work with us as they were kind of thrown under the bus. So that's really the. I mean, United Arab Emirates have mentioned in one article in the National, which is kind of, I want to say it's state-owned, but semi-state owned by the United Arab Emirates, and they have mentioned that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a big highlight in terms of how they saw the United States, and that is the case, I think, for a lot of other nations, not just the UAE.
Did the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria during the Trump administration have a similar effect, or would that have been eclipsed by the withdrawal from Afghanistan, or are they sort of a horse of a different color in your view?
It was very different. So the Trump withdrawal from Syria is actually mixed. There was the photo op that happened, in which there was a picture, the video of the U.S. withdrawing, but in a practice, the United States is still in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not a full withdrawal. I mean, there was some withdrawal and there were some troops leaving of Syria, but I mean, the news come up even last week that there was an attack on U.S. Army inside Syria. So the thing is that the United States is still active in Syria in terms of military. So the Trump withdrawal, I would say, was more of kind of a photo op, a press release, than it was what actually happened in practice. Is that the United States still remains active in Syria. They're still working with kind of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, in the Kurdish areas of northeastern Syria. And I think their presence there, in my opinion, is very useful. the fact that many of these allies need our support, otherwise that they will be taken by ISIS or even the regime control groups like Shabeha and all of others.
So turning now to sort of perhaps the main topic we want to make sure we cover here, which is the war in Iraq. So I have a few questions, but maybe it's better if you just start by describing your personal experiences with the conflict and sort of how you view it now, which I think is one of the main things that people are going to find very interesting when they listen to this discussion.
So I grew up in West Baghdad, which is very close to the airport road, which used to be called Saddam International Airport. Now it's called Baghdad International Airport. And that's where many of the US tanks that were coming into Baghdad were coming from. So my first experience with the kind of the United States was my elder brother went upstairs and then he saw that there were US tanks in front of our house. And while at the same time we were watching the local television, that was telling us that the United States military is being defeated in the south, and there is no, and they're suffering a lot of casualties, and they're being defeated. And so within kind of by the time that my brother saw the tanks, and then I went upstairs to see them, and then we heard there was a first kind of rocket or attack from the United States into my former elementary school, which was an Iraqi military base. So then there was constant fights between the Iraqi military, and then there was a kind of a paramilitary group that Saddam used to have that are from other nations that came to Iraq to fight for Iraq, for Saddam in that regard. So we were like in 5-6 days sitting in the basement of our house, kind of a corner of our house, just hearing the bullets and rockets and people fighting at each other. And then there were even, sorry.
Did you know how far ahead of time before the invasion did you and your family know that this was on the horizon?
We knew, I mean, the war started in March. There was, since the sanctions, since like even after the 1991, the Gulf War, Saddam has kind of been talking a lot that that the United States is constantly going to be attacking us and invading us and all of that.
Do you think? I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you think it sort of became a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way?
Maybe for the Saddam regime, yes. And for us, I mean, growing up in Baghdad, I mean, the United States attacked Iraq in 1999. There was a rocket attack by Bill Clinton against the base of the Iraqi military. So by the early March,
to the assassination attempt of George H.W. Bush, I suppose.
Sorry?
In response to when George Bush Sr. was in Kuwait, and there was the concern that there was an assassination plot against him.
Possibly, I mean so there was an attack, before 2003, and I remember hearing the sirens as a kid. When we know that things were escalating was, I think, in early February, where the Iraqi military was burning tires to kind of create a lot of smoke, and then that was kind of an old way to stop the American F-16s and the helicopters from working, which obviously didn't work out well because the Iraqi military was defeated in a couple of weeks. And then the stores were going to close and all that stuff, but the Baghdad itself was not, at the beginning, most of the conflict was happening in the south, and then Baghdad itself didn't start until I think the end of March, early April, and then April 9th is when the war technically ended. And then after that, so that was kind of to some extent felt unrealistic, is that we've always growing up believing that, at least me personally, because I went to a super kind of Baptist elementary school, and we were taught that even this first story of the Gulf War was that the United States with 33 countries invaded Iraq, and we won that war. So we were not told the story that Iraq invaded Kuwait and then it's technically got its ass kicked, but that was not the story that we were told as children.
Well, it's no wonder then that you're so interested in sort of providing information that goes beyond censorship, sort of when your own upbringing, your understanding of your own country is so sort of clouded by the state propaganda.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, Iraq moved from 1984 to Brave New World. So I mean, Iraq was very close to, I mean, in modern sense, what we consider like countries like Turkmenistan or even to some extent North Korea. I mean, in terms of the information landscape, there was two media channels. One is owned by Saddam and one is owned by his son. The newspapers and all information, whether it's in education systems and newspapers, etc., pretty much all owned by the regime. It was a socialist country. So as a result, like your scope of information is that. And that's why, and in a way, what was interesting is like after the war in 2003, when I started meeting people from the South and other parts of the country, they had a completely different story of what was happening. So like you started having like a kind of a balkanized version of information in which your reality and somebody from a different province which had different issues will have a completely different version of reality of what really happened. In terms of like provinces that were kind of border provinces that were closer to Iran or closer to Kuwait, etc., they knew that Iraq lost the war with Kuwait. They saw the Iraqi soldiers leaving. For those of us who were kind of a bit far, we didn't know because the central government and the propaganda ministry of propaganda focused a lot on the capital city where I grew up in, and we had a very different version of reality. So which eventually spilled out. I mean, to move a bit forward after 2003, that's where to some extent that's where everything, all the planning the United States had and all the information that they had before the invasion, most of it ended up being not true. In terms of how people would respond, how I mean, there was this theory that all Iraqis will come out and will come out as liberators and everybody would be singing Kumbaya. In reality, that did not what happened. There was one group of people that was really happy about the US invasion, and that's the Kurds. I mean, until today, the United States didn't fire a bullet in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. It's been an ally of the United States for decades. So that part of the country, yes, there were lots of people celebrating the United States. There were a lot of people happy. Where I grew up was the areas that many of them were sympathetic to the former regime. And some of them were Saddam Hussein generals and army and all of that stuff. These people were not happy about the US invasion. The people who were kind of persecuted in the South were 50-50. Some hated Saddam Hussein, but they also hated the West. So in a way is that that the U.S. intervention did not make them like the U.S. more, but in fact, it was then after a while they got propaganda from Iran and other religious places in a way that made them hate the United States immediately, even though they were liberated by the United States, and without the United States, but they would have suffered hundreds of thousands of people killed. So as a result, like when the U.S. came in 2003, everything was pretty calm the first couple of weeks. And by calm, I mean there was no militias and terrorist groups. There was still a lot of looting and a lot of kind of government buildings being stolen and all of that stuff. And I'm sure that many people have seen the videos. But then after that, then the country started immediately get disintegrated. So yeah, we had my neighborhood and the areas that I grew up in, which is closer to what's Fallujah and Ramadi, which is a kind of one of the areas that the U.S. have suffered the most in terms of soldiers killed. So you had these areas, and that's where I grew up. And then you had kind of different areas across the country which were controlled by different militias and different and represented by different people.
So zooming out a little bit, Faisal, you are broadly speaking a defender of the invasion of Iraq, and think that a lot of sort of positive outcomes flowed from that. You're not alone in that. Victor Davis Hanson, for one, has kind of pointed to a slew of sort of positive impacts that stem from the invasion. And as you're probably aware, in most of sort of in vogue American political discourse on both the left and sort of the populist right is sort of taken as axiomatic that the invasion of Iraq was a very bad thing. So maybe you could briefly make the case for why going on 20 years since the invasion in March of 2003. What is the case for why Americans might want to reevaluate sort of their almost taken as a given view that the war was a colossal mistake?
Yes, so my view is that there are some positive, not. I mean, the best case of defense right now is that Iraq is much freer today than it was under the regime of Saddam Hussein, with all of the issues that Iraq now is facing, with the kind of the corruption of the government and even the militias, etc. In terms of kind of what are sometimes the objectives of the war, which is that Iraq becomes a stable democracy, or a democracy of some sort, with people having kind of free press and freedoms. For me, this is undeniable, that the people right now are much freer. They have, as I mentioned, Iraq has a free access to the internet. Most people are connected. There are some regions that benefited a lot from that US invasion, which is, I mentioned, the Kurdistan region of Iraq. If you look at pictures of Kurdistan from the year 2000 to the year 2023, and I visit the region quite frequently. As mentioned, I have an office there in the northern part of Iraq. You will see massive difference. You will see that there are some applications of free enterprise. There are some free press, even though they still have the same kind of ruling family. So there's a lot of caveats. I mean, I try to not build a glamorous vision of what Iraq is right now. It's not Copenhagen, but the thing is that by comparison to the region, in comparison to its history, Iraq right now have very kind of stable methods to evolve. For those who have some familiarity with Iraq's history, I mean, Iraq started first as a kingdom by the British, and then the French when they divided the country in the region after World War I, and there was the king, and then the son of the king was killed by the communists, and the communists were killed by the socialists, and then the socialists were removed by Saddam Hussein. So that's kind of really the history of Iraq 101. So pretty much most of the transitions that happened in between were non-peaceful. So for the first time in Iraq history, we are resolving the transition of power through peaceful means. So these are kind of the things that I try to focus on, but not by me just trying to be optimistic and trying to kind of build any glamorous image, is that Iraqis are less and less resolving their disputes through parliament, through democracy, and resolving it through violence. There are some exceptions that happens once in a while, and I think that the story has not ended for Iraq. I think that there is still room and a pathway for it to evolve to be a country that I think many people were expecting it to be within the span of a couple of years, but I think it's going to take at least 20 years more for that to happen.
Just to clarify, so I didn't hear you for a second. You had said that Iraq is increasingly settling political differences through a democratic process rather than violence.
Yes.
So also, it's a little bit like that famous quip about the French Revolution, that it's too soon to tell, perhaps, whether or not the invasion was a success.
I definitely subscribe to that. I think in the grand scheme of things, of history of the Middle East and the region, I think is that many people are looking more for immediate results, and many of these things are very long term. Even the work of my organization, I mean, we do have 6 million people watching our content and reading it, etc. For me to expect that change will happen in the region overnight is very unlikely. Otherwise, I wouldn't have started the organization. So I think the story of Iraq is not done. I think that there are a lot of, especially the younger generation right now, who, as a result of them living their entire life under this kind of post-Saddam world, they are very different. So Iraq now, to some extent, has a different generation that is more informed, that is more connected, that has different demands than kind of my parents' generation, who lived their entire life under authoritarianism, and they don't think that there is anything that can be done. While the newer generation is more politically active, politically engaged, and these are the people that, I mean, that's why I try to tell people not to give up on Iraq or the people of Iraq, because there are people who are on the front lines fighting for these ideals, And then America's response is like, okay, we withdrew, we're just gonna leave it and let them kill each other. And then eventually when that happens is that we will end up with the kind of the same issue that we had previously, which you have an authoritarian regime that is unhinged, to say the least, and then they go invade other countries, and then America will have to go back to Iraq, and or any other countries will have to go back to Iraq to fix the issue. So I think is that the challenges that Iraq is facing right now, as a result, some of them as a result of the chaos of the invasion, I think they're resolvable. And I think it's eventually it's up to the Iraqis to decide what kind of country they want to live in. But I think is that there is a lot of hope every time I go there and I meet with the kind of the new generation. I think that they definitely want the Iraq for their country to be a successful one, and that's the conversation in Iraq. I mean, most people have now forgotten about the war. I mean, that while still there are still people who have lost family members of that chaotic invasion, etc. Many Iraqis that I talk to right now are mostly talking about the future, and they're talking about what their position is in the world, and how can they be more connected to their neighbors. There was the Arab Gulf Cup happened last year, in which Iraq finally declared that it's kind of reconnecting back to the Gulf world, which as a result of the invasion of Kuwait did not happen for a while. So I think the story of Iraq is a constantly evolving one, and I think we have to kind of, those who are interested in the war should always listen to it.
So you mentioned that in your view, the war provided an opening for democracy rather than sort of Saddam's rather autocratic type of government. What is sort of the before and after in terms of women in Iraq, sort of before and after the invasion?
It depends. I mean, Saddam, when he started his regime in 1979, he branded himself as a kind of a secular Arab nationalist. So during that period of time, Iraq was kind of under a more like secular authoritarian version. And after 1991, he declared what's called the Faith Campaign. The Faith Campaign that's when Iraq started having Allahu Akbar in the Iraqi flag. That was done by Saddam Hussein after 1991, and then he switched the country from kind of an Arab nationalist secular country to an Islamic state. From that itself, it kind of the federal Iraq, which is mostly the Arabs and other minorities live. Iraq was slowly transitioning into kind of hyper-conservative, hyper-religious society. As a result of that, then one of the effects of that is that women start having less and less rights. And me growing up during the Faith Campaign, even elementary schools used to be segregated in terms of that there was a wall in which the girls would go to a different part of the school and then the boys would go to a different part of the school. So that's where the country started getting more and more conservative. That is kind of what's the federal Iraq. The Kurdistan region of Iraq is a different story. Kurdistan region of Iraq remained secular all the time from 1991 until today. So in terms of women's rights, they have not really changed. They haven't evolved into a more ultra-conservative ruling. So different parts of the country have kind of different ways when it comes to treatment of women, but also treatment of minorities and religious freedom in general.
Economically, do you have a sense of sort of you allude to free enterprise increasingly that you're witnessing when there? Do you have a sense of sort of the per capita GDP, for instance, kind of before and after the invasion, and sort of the kind of relative economic position of your average Iraqi?
So that's where there's a significant change. I mean, I don't know currently what the GDP is, but during the regime of Saddam Hussein, so the way that it was kind of the pyramid is that if you were most of the time Sunni, but you are a member of the Ba'ath Party, you have a very different kind of economic system than the rest of the country. So even if something's like education system, so if you were a son of a Ba'athist and you go to high school diploma and you have 70 out of 100 in the exam, then you're eligible to enter medical school, which is you need to score 90 out of 100 to enter. So they had the people who were close to the regime and his associated circle, they had a completely different lifestyle. And so that's sometimes what, there were some pictures that sometimes I see on the internet is that, oh, look at Iraq after the war. and they show like the super fancy neighborhoods and everybody with their BMWs and kind of luxury lifestyle. Most of these areas are the areas that were associated with the regime. But the rest of the country was completely destroyed. Mainly the southern provinces, and that's where a significant amount of the population lives. So they kind of, that's part of the propaganda of the anti-US propaganda of showing that Iraq was kind of a Beverly Hills, and then suddenly the US came in and it became Baltimore. And that's
what I think. That's one of the reasons I wanted to, talk to you in this discussion is I think, a lot of us here in the United States, we've never been to Iraq. We didn't grow up there. And we don't know some of these details. For instance, we're learning, as from your description here, that there are major regional differences in the country. I think most people are probably somewhat familiar with the story of the Kurds and how they arguably stood most to benefit from the invasion. I think probably most people who follow the Middle East, even kind of a cursory sense, probably are familiar with that. But this is really interesting about how different regions of the country, the South and such, may have been impacted differently by this sort of change in government.
Yeah, Iraq is a multi-ethnic, multicultural country with a lot of history and differences, and each, there are obviously differences within a group. So, even right now with Iraq's politics, the Shias themselves, who represent the majority, are divided, for example, on the question of Iran. There are some Shias who think that Iraq is.
You read my mind. I want to ask you about that.
Huh?
You read my mind. I wanted to, before we finish, be sure to ask you about that.
Yeah, so there's kind of a schism within the Shia world, within Iraq in particular, is that some, and that's some extent is a question of what identity. So some see themselves as Shias first, Iraqis second, and some see themselves as Iraqi first and Shia second. So those who believe the first, they think that Iraq and Iran should be close allies because to some extent we are an extension of each other. And so they also believe in ideas beyond borders, just different ideas. So they see that the world, to some extent, is borderless, and the Islamic Revolution, which is what Ayatollah Khomeini started, to some extent, the people in Iraq are an extension of that revolution. Then there are those who believe that Iraqi Shias, who are mostly Arabs, have their identity first before the Islamic Revolution. So they can, Iran will always remain our neighbor, and we should work with it. But they're also a different culture, a different background. So even within the Iraqi parliament, there's that schism between those who think that we are an extension of the Iran Revolution and those who think that we are completely different and we have to, in fact, be more closer to Saudi Arabia and UAE and Bahrain because we're an Arab country, not a Persian one. So that extends even like within kind of the system itself. There are a lot of divisions. The Sunnis have also their own divisions of those who kind of believe in the political process and those who don't. And then to those who eventually run for elections and like people like the Speaker of the Parliament. And then there are those who think that we should not even work with the Shias and the only way to do it is through violence. And that's the groups like ISIS and others are like from Iraqi politics. ISIS can be understood as a revolution of certain people against the Shia government. That's what ISIS is for a lot of Iraqis. It's not just like a kind of a group that showed up out of nowhere. It was an opposition group, just a violent one.
So I think any discussion of the war in Iraq, I guess, is woefully incomplete without mentioning sort of the death toll of a lot of the people there. You sort of mentioned that a lot of people are kind of looking to move to the future. Where is the sort of thoughts of a lot of people within Iraq about who, lost family members, lost friends in that conflict?
So, the unfortunate history and reality of Iraq, the people killed is the norm. So one of the, unfortunately, not necessarily cynical, but also very sad argument that in kind of the defense of the war is that the fact that these hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who were killed as a result post the chaotic invasion would have been killed anyway. So it's, in the last 10 years of Saddam Hussein, even before the last 10 years, There was a revolution happened after the first Gulf War, where first started by the Kurds and in the south, and then as a result of Saddam curbing on that revolution, he was massacring people by the tens of thousands. So my argument is that even if the U.S. did not intervene in 2003 and Saddam Hussein would not removed, my argument is that we would have had ended up exactly what Syria is right now, in which these hundreds of thousands of people who are now killed in Syria. The only difference is that they will be Iraqis, not Syrians. And Saddam Hussein will most likely get the support from Russia to defend himself from the local revolutions happening in different provinces, and he would just bomb the hell out of everybody, and then we would have been exactly ended up in the same situation. So unfortunately, the reality is that you only have a couple of very bad options, and that's something that's maybe hard to comprehend. Even when I talk about the Middle East and even work in the Middle East, I don't look at things from whether things are good or bad. I look at them whether it's like bad or worse. So how can we make the situation less worse, not good? Because good is not something that is within the horizon, but what is in the horizon is that how can we make things better than the situation that we are in right now? So if the death toll, in my opinion, which is a lot, and we're still in constant discovery, we're even still discovering the death toll of Saddam Hussein. Like every kind of months, there is a news in Iraqi media about, oh, we discovered a mass grave in this desert in this province. And so until today, we don't even know how many people Saddam Hussein killed. And I'm sure we also don't know how many people were killed by the militias and all of the civil war that happened after the war. So unfortunately, it's a constant stage of country in which lives don't matter by the militias, but by the regimes. And my hope is that as Iraq moves away from that era, then this will not become the norm. Maybe when I have like sometimes calls with some of my elementary school friends or high school friends there, and I tell them, was like, how is the situation? And they're like, oh, well, like we don't have 1,000 people killed every week. So that is like a standard. That was like the standard they grew up under. And for them, that 100% killed instead of 1,000, that's good news. So this is kind of the standard where Iraq was for, not just because of the war, for at least for the past 40 years.
So I have kind of two remaining questions, and then we'll kind of close with a little bit of a zoom out. But a lot of people, I think, are familiar with sort of the dynamic, and maybe the comparison you would argue is inaccurate, and I welcome your feedback in it, but they'll take a look at someone like Saddam or Gaddafi in Libya, and they'll say, okay, there's a really bad guy in there, and he's doing a really bad thing or whatever, and then, we're going to take him out. And is the situation worse before or after? And I guess when it comes to Iraq, you've sort of made the case that it's actually probably better after. Do you have similar thoughts on Libya?
So the timeline in which these wars happened is everything. I mean, now the militias and kind of paramilitary groups have evolved significantly in the past decade. So the way the Libya conflict can be looked at its own as kind of a separate conflict than Iraq, because now it's like everybody is sort of involved in Libya. I mean, Russia is very heavily involved, the United States, the Gulf states, like, which used to be less involved in the Middle East affairs, now are involved. So I mean, mainly, I mean, even in Iraq, I mean, as I said, like some areas are doing much better and some areas are doing not that much better. I'm guessing that the case is for Libya as well, is that some areas that are probably not kind of sympathetic to the regime, etc., they might have the former regime, they might be doing in a much better place. But Libya is in a way far more chaotic and worse than in Iraq in terms of just looking from the big picture, in terms of how many groups are fighting. And the fight is not necessarily like Iraq is more sectarian bent, while the same with Libya and Sudan happening right now is mostly about just groups that wanting power. So there is less kind of a sectarian angle, but more about this tribe fights this tribe, and one have to kill the other for them to rule over the country.
I know a common sort of criticism of America's orientation toward the world is we're always often looking at things from a very America-centric viewpoint, but you and I are both sitting in the United States right now, so I'll kind of ask this as the final question of sorts before I just want to ask a final kind of zoom out point. But what American politicians or political factions right now do you think are articulating the best U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East?
None, in my opinion. I mean, there was this school of neoconservatism, which is now mostly dead, and it was kind of self-defeating. And many of them, I think, now work for MSNBC, like people from Bill
Right.
Crystal to others. I mean, that group had kind of I would say like the big ideas of spreading democracy in American world, but they had no idea of how to implement it. So they had the big ideas, they had no idea how to implement it. Then, as a result of kind of that school, there was what I call the reactionary neocon. Is that it is not so like the neocon school is like America is the source for all good in the world, and the reason why we have world peace was America. And then there's the other school which is like everything that's happening bad in the world is because of America. So if there's any bad news happening elsewhere, we must have been screwed up there somewhere. So eventually, kind of it became kind of self-loathing form of foreign policy. Is that America's working the world better, is making it worse. The truth is it's somewhere in between, and not like to be a centrist in this regard. Is that it's really I think is that might sound like a bit complicated, but I think is that American politics have to be rational in the first place domestically before it can be rational in a foreign setting. Because I mean the outside world is kind of very different, and we cannot apply what works in Kansas what works in Baghdad. So I think is that if what I try to look at foreign policy approach is first of all look at evidence and then work within it, not have the ideals and then try to fit the evidence to fit these ideals. It's like understand as much as you can about these countries and see if there is a room for intervention from the US, whether it's a soft power or military power, is how can we make things better, and how can we empower the people there to take the leadership of their own countries, and less about us trying to save the world or being the quote unquote the world police. And how can we empower the voices of people who believe in many of the ideals that America shares in these countries to make sure that we have an world order that values democracy and human rights and freedom as a central piece of it.
So to close, Faisal, obviously the Middle East is not a monolithic place, and at various points in this discussion, we've touched on some bright spots where you've expressed optimism that people in Iraq are now able to access the internet more and have some more freedom of enterprise. And on the other hand, sort of this conflict within Iraq's domestic political scene about closeness to Iran. We've touched briefly on Libya. You've alluded to Yemen. For someone sitting in the United States who kind of wants to expand their knowledge a little bit about the key things going on in the Middle East, what are sort of 2 or 3 things they need to watch in the next year or 2?
They need to watch for the new generation, the one that is post-Arab Spring, post-internet generation, the one that is very connected much more connected to the world than the previous ones. They can talk to them. They can get connected to them through the technologies now we have. The other thing is that they should look for even for the lack of a better word, the liberalization or the reformation happening in the Middle East. If you look at examples like Saudi Arabia, like Bahrain, like others, you see the pictures of kind of what women used to wear in Saudi Arabia in public and what now is changing. You'll see that there are some of the regimes in the Middle East, in order for them to adapt to modernity, they have to adjust. And because of the fact that the Middle East is not just oil dependent at the moment, and everybody's trying to diversify their economy, there is more and more connectedness to the global markets, and as a result of that, they have to modernize to adapt to the global market. So this concept is we can do whatever we want because we have oil and natural gas. That is going to become less and less in the next decade. And I try to my best to kind of simplify and write about these subjects, and I have my own Substack, which is faisal.substack.com. where I try to I interviewed the U.S. ambassador to Sudan, former ambassador to Sudan in my latest one, and I'm hoping to write the next article about Saudi Arabia and the kind of the evolution and some challenges that are facing the country there. So that could be, if people are interested, they can follow me there. And Ideas Beyond Borders, of course.
Great. So Faisal, really appreciate the time today. I think this has been a learning experience for me. So I was very interested to hear sort of the experience of someone who actually grew up amid this conflict. And thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.